Admiral Verthax stood on the command bridge of the mighty warship Eternal Conquest, and he felt proud of what he saw through the viewing screens all around him. For his armada stretched across the darkness of space like an endless sea of metal and fire. And every single one of those 2,000 warships belonged to him and obeyed his every command. Without question or hesitation, the Dominion had given him this fleet, because he was their greatest warrior and he had never lost a single battle in his entire career of conquest. And now he was leading these ships toward another primitive world that would soon bow before the might of his empire. Just like 17 other species had done before them when they faced the unstoppable power of the Dominion Armada. His 4 eyes scanned the bridge where dozens of officers worked at their stations with perfect discipline and focus. And his 2 hearts beat with the steady rhythm of a commander who knew that victory was always certain when he was in charge. And his scaled skin reflected the blue glow of the holographic displays that showed him every ship in his magnificent fleet. Senior Commander Crix approached him with a tablet in her clawed hands, and she bowed her head in respect before speaking. And she told him that all ships were maintaining perfect formation and that they would reach the target system within 3 standard cycles. And Verthax nodded with satisfaction, because everything was going exactly according to his carefully designed plan. He had spent many years studying the art of war, and he had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds and brought glory to the Dominion with every campaign he commanded. And he believed that nothing in this galaxy could possibly stand against the combined might of 2,000 warships armed with the most advanced weapons that his species had ever created. But then, something happened that would change everything forever. The sensor officer at his station suddenly made a sound that Verthax had never heard before, a kind of choking gasp that seemed to come from deep within his throat. And his hands began to shake so badly that he could barely keep them on his console. And when Verthax turned to look at him, he saw pure terror in the young officer's eyes. "What is wrong with you?" Verthax demanded in his most commanding voice. And he walked toward the sensor station with quick, angry steps, because he did not tolerate weakness or fear from any member of his crew. But when he got close enough to see the display screen, his own confidence began to crack like ice under pressure. A ship had appeared directly in front of the Armada, dropping out of hyperspace in a flash of distorted light and impossible energy signatures. And it was just sitting there in the darkness of space, like it had every right to be there, like it was waiting for them, like it had known exactly where they would be and when they would arrive. The sensor officer's voice trembled as he reported what the instruments were telling him. And he said that the ship's design matched nothing in their database, except for one category that made everyone on the bridge go completely silent. And that category was labeled with a warning that had been programmed into every Dominion computer system for the past 20 cycles. It was a human ship. Verthax felt his heart skip their rhythm for just a moment, and he hated himself for that moment of weakness. But he could not deny the cold fear that began to spread through his body like poison in his blood, because he had heard the stories just like everyone else had heard them. And he knew what that small angular vessel represented. The ship was ugly by Dominion standards. All hard angles and thick armor plating and exposed weapon systems that made no attempt to look elegant or beautiful. And it ran so hot that half of the sensor array was struggling to get accurate readings. And it was broadcasting no identification signal at all, which meant it did not care if they knew who it was. Communications officer Verthax commanded while forcing his voice to remain steady and calm. "Send a message to all ships in the fleet and tell them to hold their positions and wait for further orders. And do it now before anyone does something foolish." But he was already too late. The signal had already spread across the fleet's shared network faster than he could have possibly prevented it. And every ship in the Armada now knew that a human vessel was blocking their path. And the reaction was immediate and catastrophic in ways that Verthax had never seen before in all his years of military service. The communications channels exploded with noise as hundreds of captains began talking at once, and their voices were filled with panic and terror and desperate prayers to gods that the Dominion had stopped worshipping generations ago. And Verthax could hear officers screaming and crews crying and commanders demanding answers that nobody could give them. 3 cruisers on the left flank suddenly broke formation and tried to turn away from the human ship at the same time, and their navigation systems were so overwhelmed by the panicked commands of their crews that they collided with each other in a massive explosion that killed thousands of soldiers in an instant. To destroy a captain began broadcasting a surrender signal even though no one had fired a single weapon yet, and another captain was ordering his crew to abandon ship despite the fact that they were nowhere near any planet or station that could save them. And the chaos spread through the fleet like a disease that had no cure. Verthax slammed his fist against the command console and roared for silence, and he demanded that his officers restore order immediately. And he threatened to execute anyone who abandoned their post or showed cowardice in the face of the enemy. But he could see in their eyes that his threats meant nothing compared to the fear they felt. His tactical officer approached him with a face that had gone pale beneath her scales, and she told him in a whisper that 12 ships had already jumped to hyperspace and fled without permission, and that another 40 ships were reporting mutinies as enlisted crews tried to force their officers to retreat, and that the fleet was falling apart before his eyes. How is this possible? Verthax growled through clenched teeth, and he stared at the viewing screen where the human ship continued to drift silently in the void, and it had not moved or powered up its weapons or done anything at all except exist. And yet his mighty armada was destroying itself just because of its presence. The human ship was small compared to his flagship, probably no bigger than a medium destroyer in the Dominion fleet, and it carried a crew of maybe 200 beings at most. And by all logical analysis, it should have been nothing more than a minor obstacle that his armada could crush without effort. But logic had no power here, because every officer and soldier in his fleet had grown up hearing the stories about humans, and those stories had planted seeds of terror deep in their minds that no amount of training or discipline could ever remove. And now those seeds had grown into a forest of fear that was strangling his entire command. Verthax looked around his bridge and saw his officers staring at their screens with wide eyes and trembling hands. And he saw young soldiers clutching religious symbols they had hidden in their uniforms. And he saw veterans who had survived dozens of battles, looking like frightened children facing a monster from their worst nightmares. And through it all, the human ship just waited in the darkness, patient and silent and absolutely terrifying. And Admiral Verthax realized that for the first time in his entire career, he had no idea what to do next. Verthax stood frozen at his command station while the chaos continued to rage across his fleet, and his mind drifted back to the first time he had heard about humans, back when he was just a young cadet at the Imperial Military Academy with dreams of glory and conquest filling his head. His instructor had been an old warrior named Admiral Kreth, who had lost 3 of his 4 arms in a battle that nobody was allowed to talk about. And one day, Kreth had gathered all the cadets into a dark room and told them that he was going to teach them the most important lesson they would ever learn in their entire military careers. He had dimmed the lights until the room was almost completely black, and then he had put an image on the screen that showed a small blue and green planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. And he had asked the cadets if any of them knew what world this was. None of them had known the answer because the planet looked so ordinary and harmless. And Kreth had smiled a terrible smile that still haunted Verthax even now after all these years. And then he had spoken a single word that changed everything the cadets thought they knew about the universe Earth. Kreth had said, and his voice had been quiet and serious in a way that made every cadet lean forward to listen. And he had explained that this innocent-looking world was the most dangerous place in the entire galaxy. More dangerous than black holes or supernovas or the radioactive wastelands of the Forbidden Zone. The cadets had laughed nervously because they thought their instructor was joking. But Kreth did not laugh with them. And instead, he began to describe the nightmare that was the human homeworld. In words that painted pictures of horror in their young minds, Earth was what scientists called a death world. A category of planets so hostile to life that most species could not survive, there for more than a few hours without advanced protection. And yet somehow the humans had not only survived there, but had thrived and evolved and eventually conquered every corner of their murderous planet. The atmosphere was filled with a corrosive gas called oxygen that would burn the lungs of most species and cause their blood to catch fire from the inside. And the humans breathed this poison with every breath and actually needed it to survive. And their bodies had evolved to use this deadly substance as fuel for their impossible endurance. The planet experienced wild temperature swings that would kill most known life forms. From frozen wastelands where water turned to solid ice to burning deserts where the ground could cook flesh. And the humans had learned to survive in all of these environments by covering themselves in the skins of dead animals and building shelters from whatever materials they could find. Massive geological events called earthquakes would shake the ground without warning and destroy entire cities. And giant waves called tsunamis would rise from the oceans and wash away everything in their path. And mountains would explode with molten rock and poison gas. And still the humans refused to die. But the most terrifying thing about Earth was not the planet itself, but the creatures that lived there alongside the humans. Because Earth was filled with predators and parasites and venomous monsters that would give any sane species nightmares for the rest of their lives. There were creatures called sharks that could smell a single drop of blood from miles away and would tear victims apart with rows of razor-sharp teeth. And creatures called crocodiles that had survived unchanged for millions of years because they were already perfect killing machines. And tiny insects that carried diseases which had killed more humans than all their wars combined. And the humans had not only survived among these horrors, but had actually formed emotional bonds with some of them, keeping deadly predators as companions and pets, showing affection to creatures that could kill them with a single bite or scratch. And this was perhaps the strangest thing about them of all. Kreth had paused in his lecture and looked at each cadet with his one remaining eye. And he had told them that everything he had described so far was just the background, just the setting that had created the humans. And now he was going to tell them what the humans themselves were actually like. Humans were persistence hunters. He had explained, which meant that they did not catch their prey by being faster or stronger or having better natural weapons. But instead, they simply followed their target for hours or days or even weeks until the prey collapsed from exhaustion and could not run anymore. They could keep moving long after any other species would have stopped to rest. And their bodies could repair damage that would be fatal to others. And they could function with injuries that would leave most beings screaming in agony. And they considered pain to be nothing more than information to be acknowledged and then ignored. Their bones were dense and strong and would break. Weapons designed to cut through armor. And their muscles were capable of explosive power that could throw objects with deadly accuracy. And their reflexes were fast enough to catch flying insects out of the air with their bare hands. But what made humans truly dangerous was not their bodies, but their minds. Because humans had evolved to solve problems in ways that no other species had ever imagined. and they had a concept called spite that drove them to pursue revenge against their enemies long after any rational being would have given up. Verthax remembered how Kreth had told them about the great mistake that the Cathari hegemony had made 20 cycles ago, when they had decided that the humans were weak and primitive and could be easily conquered and enslaved. Like so many other species before them, the Cathari had attacked a small human colony on a world called New Manila, and they had killed 10,000 human civilians and captured another 50,000 to sell as slaves. And they had believed that the Terran Union would accept this loss and negotiate for peace, because surely no species would risk war over such a small number of their own. They had been terribly wrong. The Terran Union had responded to the attack on New Manila by mobilizing their entire military force and launching a campaign of total war against the Cathari that had shocked every other species in the galaxy. And they had not stopped until they had completely destroyed the Cathari civilization forever. In just 13 hours, the humans had turned the Cathari homeworld into a ball of molten glass using weapons that converted matter directly into energy. And they had hunted down every Cathari fleet and orbital station and colony ship until there was nothing left of the once proud hegemony except ruins and ashes and survivors who had to beg other species for protection. And then the humans had done something that terrified the galaxy even more than the destruction itself. Because after they had finished killing billions of Cathari, they had issued a formal apology to the galactic community for any inconvenience their war might have caused. And they had offered humanitarian aid to the survivors of the species they had just nearly exterminated. Humans were not conquerors who wanted to rule the galaxy like the Dominion did. And they were not religious fanatics who wanted to convert other species to their beliefs. And they were not traders who wanted to exploit other worlds for profit and resources. The humans were protectors. And they had made it absolutely clear that anyone who threatened their people or their allies would face consequences that no rational being could ever consider proportional or reasonable. And they would deliver those consequences with terrifying efficiency and then go right back to their peaceful lives as if nothing had happened. Kreth had ended his lecture by telling the cadets that there was only one rule they needed to remember about humans. And that rule was simple and absolute and would keep them alive. If they were smart enough to follow it, never give the humans a reason to notice you, he had said, and never threaten anything they care about. And if you ever see a human ship approaching your position, you should do everything in your power to convince them that you are friendly and harmless and not worth their time. Verthax had remembered that lesson for his entire career, and he had followed it perfectly. And he had built his reputation by conquering species that were far away from human space and posed no threat to human interests. But now a human ship was sitting directly in front of his armada, and Verthax finally understood why his fleet was falling apart around him. Because every single being under his command had heard the same stories he had heard. And they all knew exactly what that small angular vessel was capable of doing to them if they made the wrong choice. The Armada was dying, and Admiral Verthax could do nothing but watch as his mighty fleet tore itself apart from the inside. And the communications channels were filled with so much noise and panic that he could barely hear his own officers trying to give him reports about the escalating disaster. Vice Admiral Silketh appeared on his personal screen, and her face was hard and determined, in a way that made Verthax's stomach clench with sudden fear, because he recognized that expression from soldiers who had already made up their minds about what they were going to do, no matter what their commanders ordered them to do. "Am withdrawing my forces from this armada," Silketh announced in a voice that left no room for argument or negotiation. And behind her, Verthax could see her bridge crew already working on hyperspace calculations. and he knew that nothing he said would change her decision. "You cannot do this." Verdax growled at her through the screen, and he reminded her that desertion in the face of the enemy was punishable by death under Dominion law, and he threatened to have her entire family stripped of their titles and thrown into labor camps if she abandoned her post. Scythe laughed at him, and it was not a happy laugh, but rather the bitter sound of someone who had stopped caring about consequences because they were more afraid of staying than leaving. And she leaned closer to the screen so that Verthax could see every scale on her face. "My brother died at the Soul incident." She hissed at him with hatred burning in her eyes. And he was serving on a diplomatic vessel that was supposed to be protected by interstellar law. And the humans destroyed it anyway because it was traveling with a Cathari convoy. And I watched the recording of his ship being vaporized in less than a second. She pulled back from the screen and her voice became cold and professional again. And she told him that she had 300 ships under her direct command and that every single captain had agreed to follow her away from this disaster. And she was not going to let Dominion pride kill them the way it had killed her brother. The connection cut off and Verthax watched on the tactical display as 300 warships peeled away from the formation and accelerated toward the edge of the system, and their hyperspace engines began to glow with the building energy that would carry them far away from here. A dozen other captains saw what Silkith was doing and decided to follow her example. And soon there were ships breaking formation all across the Armada as commanders chose survival over loyalty. And Verthax's S-fleet was shrinking before his eyes, like ice melting under a hot sun. But not everyone was running away from the human ship, because some officers were too proud or too stupid or too faithful to accept retreat. And one of them was about to make a terrible mistake that would show everyone exactly why the humans were so feared. The Zealot-class Dreadnought Purity of Purpose suddenly broke from the main formation and accelerated directly toward the human vessel. And its weapon systems began to power up with the distinctive whine of plasma cannons charging to full capacity. And its commander's voice echoed across every channel in the fleet. "I am High Priest Varric Mole of this sacred order." The commander screamed with religious fervor dripping from every word. "And I do not fear these human demons because the gods of our ancestors protect me. And I will cleanse this abomination from our path and prove that the Dominion cannot be intimidated by a single enemy ship." Verthax tried to order Varric Mole to stand down and return to formation, but the Zealot ignored him completely and continued his charge toward the human destroyer. And the bridge crew of the Eternal Conquest watched in horrified silence as the massive dreadnought closed the distance between the two vessels. The human ship still had not moved from its position, and its weapons remained powered down, and its shields were not raised. And it gave no indication that it even noticed a heavily armed warship racing toward it, with obvious hostile intent for a brief moment. Verthax allowed himself to hope that maybe the humans were not as dangerous as the stories claimed, and maybe this single destroyer was damaged or undermanned or simply bluffing, and maybe Varric Mole would actually succeed in destroying it and proving that the Dominion had nothing to fear. Then the human ship fired. Verthax did not even see the projectile because it moved far too fast for any sensor system to track in real time, and the tactical computers had to reconstruct what happened from the energy signatures and debris patterns that were left behind after. Everything was over a single kinetic round had been launched from the human destroyer at approximately 4% of the speed of light, which was fast enough to cross the distance between the two ships in less time than it took Verthax to blink his 4 eyes. The round had struck the Purity of Purpose directly in the bow and had passed completely through the massive dreadnought without slowing down at all, exiting through the engine section and continuing on into the void, where it would probably travel forever. The dreadnought came apart in a bloom of white fire as its reactor lost containment and converted the entire ship into a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated plasma and twisted metal. And 6,000 crew members died instantly without ever knowing what had hit them. Vorthak's tactical officer whispered the analysis in a voice that shook with barely controlled terror. And she explained that the human vessel had calculated the exact trajectory needed to hit the dreadnought while it was performing evasive maneuvers. And it had compensated for relativistic effects and gravitational drift and a dozen other variables that would take a Dominion targeting computer several seconds to process. The humans had done all of that in 0.003 of a second, and the human ship still had not raised its shields. The destruction of the purity of purpose broke whatever discipline remained in the Armada. And Vorthak watched on his displays as hundreds of ships began to flee in every direction, and captains abandoned their posts in crews, mutinied against their officers, and the entire fleet dissolved into chaos. 3 more ships surrendered directly to the human destroyer, broadcasting desperate pleas for asylum and begging the humans to protect them from their own commanders. And Vorthak felt sick to his stomach as he watched Dominion warships lower their shields and power down their weapons in front of an enemy vessel. His communications officer reported that nearly 100 ships had already escaped to hyperspace and that another 200 were in the process of mutiny. And the remaining vessels were so scattered and disorganized that they could not mount any kind of coordinated action. Even if they wanted to, Senior Commander Crix approached him again, and her face was pale with fear. But there was also something else in her eyes that looked almost like pity. And she told him that several of his own crew members had locked themselves in the engineering section and were threatening to sabotage the engines if he did not order a retreat. "We have to leave this place," Crix said to him in a voice that was gentle but firm. And she reminded him that his duty was to preserve as many lives as possible, and that there was no shame in retreating from an enemy that they could not possibly defeat. Vorthak wanted to argue with her and insist that he would never surrender to a single enemy ship. But he looked at the tactical display and saw the wreckage of the purity of purpose, still glowing with the heat of its destruction. And he looked at the human vessel sitting silently in the void with its shield still down and its weapons barely warm from that single devastating shot. He thought about his career and his reputation and his honor. And then he thought about the thousands of soldiers who were still loyal to him and would die if he ordered them to attack. And he thought about the families of those soldiers who would never see their loved ones again. Vorthak was many things, but he was not stupid, and he knew that this battle was already over before it had even begun. And the only question now was how many of his people would die before he accepted that reality. "Give me options," he said to Crix in a voice that sounded tired and old, even to his own ears. And she nodded and began to work on her tablet. And together they started to figure out how to save what was left of the Armada from the quiet terror of that single human ship. The communications console suddenly lit up with an incoming transmission that cut through all the chaos, a noise like a knife through soft flesh. And every screen on every ship in what remained of the Armada flickered to show the same image at exactly the same time. Vorthak stared at the screen and felt his heart stop beating for just a moment, because he was looking at a human for the first time in his life. And everything he had been taught about these terrifying creatures had not prepared him for what he actually saw. The human was female, according to the information that appeared on his tactical display. And she was small by human standards, with thin limbs and a frame that looked almost fragile compared to the massive Dominion soldiers that Vorthak commanded. And her hair was gray with age, and her face was lined with wrinkles that suggested she had lived for many decades. She had soft brown eyes that crinkled at the corners, like she smiled often. And there were laugh lines around her mouth that made her look like someone's grandmother rather than a warrior. And she was wearing a simple uniform that was neat and pressed. but not decorated with the medals and ribbons that Dominion officers covered themselves with. This tiny old creature was the commander of the ship that had just destroyed Dreadnought with a single shot, and she looked like she should be baking treats for children rather than facing down an armada of 2,000 warships. "Hello there," the human said in a voice that was calm and warm and completely relaxed. And she spoke in perfect Dominion standard, which meant she had taken the time to learn their language. And she introduced herself as Captain Lucia Vance of the Terran Union ship Remembrance Vars. Thax noticed that she had called her ship Remembrance, and he wondered what the humans were remembering and whether it had anything to do with the destruction they had brought upon their enemies in the past. And he felt a chill run down his spine at the implications of that name. "I apologize for the interruption to your journey," Captain Vance continued in a tone that sounded genuinely sorry for the inconvenience she was causing. And she explained that she had been sent to deliver a message from the Terran Union government regarding the Armada's current trajectory. She pulled up a star chart on her side of the transmission and pointed to a small dot that represented a planet 3 light years away from the Armada's projected path. And she told Verthax that this world was called New Harmony, and that it was home to a human colony of approximately 2 million civilians. "The Terran Union has noticed that your fleet's course will bring you within sensor range of New Harmony," Captain Vance said with the same calm and polite tone she had been using since the beginning of the transmission. "And we would like to respectfully request that you adjust your trajectory to avoid any possibility of misunderstanding." Cards felt his mouth go dry and his scales begin to itch with nervous sweat, because he understood exactly what the human was really saying beneath all that polite language. And he understood that this was not a request, but rather a warning delivered in the friendliest possible way. The humans had sent a single ship to stop an armada of 2,000 warships, and they had not even bothered to send a warship of significant size. And Captain Vance was speaking to him like she was asking a neighbor to please keep their noise down rather than threatening the complete destruction of his entire fleet. "I understand that you have your own mission to complete," Captain Vance continued with a sympathetic nod that seemed completely genuine. "And I want you to know that the Terran Union has no interest in interfering with Dominion activities outside of our protected space. And we certainly have no desire for conflict between our peoples." She paused for a moment, and her smile faded just slightly. And something changed in her eyes that made Verthax feel like he was being examined by a predator, deciding whether he was worth the effort of killing. And the temperature on the bridge seemed to drop several degrees. However, Captain Vance said in a voice that was still polite, but now carried an edge of steel beneath the softness, "I should mention that the Terran Union 4th Fleet is currently holding position in the Kepler system, approximately 2 jumps from here. And they have been monitoring this situation since your armada entered the sector." She let that information sink in for a moment before continuing. And she explained that the 4th Fleet consisted of 400 warships, including 6 Titan-class carriers. And each of those carriers was capable of deploying thousands of autonomous combat drones that could overwhelm any defensive system ever designed. Would really prefer not to bother them, Captain Vance said with a small apologetic shrug. "Because you know how much paperwork is involved when fleet actions are required. And honestly, I was hoping we could resolve this situation between just the 2 of us like reasonable people." Verthax looked at the old woman on his screen, and he finally understood why the humans had sent her instead of a younger, more aggressive commander. Because Captain Vance was not here to fight him. She was here to give him a chance to make the smart choice without losing face in front of his remaining crew. She was offering him an exit that he could use to preserve some of his dignity. A way to retreat that he could explain to his superiors as a tactical decision rather than a humiliating defeat. And she was doing it with such gentle courtesy that he almost felt grateful to her, but he also understood that beneath all that kindness and politeness was a species that had once destroyed an entire civilization because they had harmed a single colony. And Captain Vance's friendly smile was backed by enough firepower to turn his armada into dust if he made the wrong choice. Admiral Verthax, Captain Vance said in a tone that suggested she already knew what his answer would be. I have been doing this job for a very long time, and I have learned that most conflicts happen because of misunderstandings and poor communication rather than genuine malice. She leaned forward slightly, and her brown eyes looked directly into the camera with an intensity that belied her grandmother appearance. And she told him that she was giving him this opportunity because she believed he was a reasonable being who could recognize when a situation had changed beyond his control. Your fleet was not designed to fight humans, she said simply. And we both know that if you continue on your current path, there will be consequences that neither of us wants. And I would much rather spend the rest of my evening drinking tea and reading a book than filling out combat reports. Bridge of the Eternal Conquest was completely silent as every officer waited for their admiral to respond. And Verthax could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. And he knew that whatever he said next would determine whether, rather, thousands of his soldiers lived or died. He thought about the stories he had heard about humans and the destruction of the Kethari and the single shot that had vaporized a dreadnought. And he thought about the 400 ships waiting just 2 jumps away with their thousands of combat drones ready to launch. And then he thought about Captain Lucia Vance with her gray hair and her warm smile and her polite request that he please turn his fleet around and go away. And he realized that this tiny old human was the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced, because she had already won before the battle even started. He opened his mouth to give his answer, and he hoped that he was making the right choice for his people and his empire. And he hoped that the humans would keep their word and let him leave in peace. And most of all, he hoped that he would never have to face a human ship ever again. Admiral Verthax took a deep breath and let it out slowly before he spoke. And his voice was steady and calm, even though his hearts were pounding in his chest, like drums beating a retreat. And every officer on his bridge leaned forward to hear what their commander would say to the human captain, Captain Vance. Verthax said in his most formal and diplomatic tone, I have received your message, and I understand the concerns of the Terran Union regarding the safety of your colony. And after careful consideration, I have decided that the Dominion Armada will adjust its course to avoid any misunderstanding between our peoples. He saw several of his officers slump with relief at his words, and he heard quiet sighs and whispered prayers of thanks from crew members who had been certain they were about to die. And he felt a strange mixture of shame and pride at the decision he had just made. Captain Vance smiled at him through the screen, and her eyes crinkled with what looked like genuine warmth and approval. And she thanked him for his understanding and his wisdom. And she said that she would report to her superiors that Admiral Verthax of the Dominion was a reasonable leader who could be trusted to keep his word. That is very kind of you. Verthax replied with a bitter taste in his mouth, because he knew that his reputation was already destroyed, and that the Dominion High Command would never forgive him for retreating from a single enemy vessel, no matter how reasonable his decision had been. Captain Vance seemed to understand what he was feeling because her expression softened with something that might have been sympathy, and she told him that sometimes the bravest thing a commander could do was choose to save lives instead of spending them for pride. And she said that she respected him for making that choice. The transmission ended and Verthax stood alone on his bridge surrounded by officers who did not know whether to congratulate him for saving them or condemn him for surrendering without a fight. and he began to give the orders that would turn what remained of his armada away from human space. Senior Commander Crix worked with the navigation officers to plot a new course that would take them far away from the human colony and back toward Dominion territory. And she reported that approximately 1,200 ships were still responding to his commands and would follow him wherever he led them. The other 800 had either fled to hyperspace already or were in the middle of mutinies that would take days to resolve. And Verthax knew that he would have to answer for every single one of those lost vessels when he returned home. And he knew that his answer would not save his career. He gave the order to begin the retreat and watched as his remaining ships slowly turned away from the human destroyer and began to accelerate toward the hyperspace jump point. And he kept his eyes on the viewing screen as the small angular vessel grew smaller and smaller in the distance. Remembrance did not follow them or attempt to interfere with their withdrawal. And Captain Vance did not send any more messages or make any demands. And the human ship simply sat in the void and watched them leave like a shepherd watching wolves slink away from her flock. Verthax thought about everything he had learned about humans during this terrible day, and he realized that the stories and the legends and the warnings had all been true, but they had also missed something important about these strange creatures from the death world called Earth. The humans were not monsters or demons or mindless killing machines that destroyed everything in their path. And they were not conquerors who wanted to rule the galaxy like the Dominion did. And they were not even particularly aggressive or violent by nature. They were survivors, plain and simple. Creatures who had been forged in the fires of a world that had tried to kill them every single day of their existence. And they had learned to do whatever was necessary to protect themselves, and the people they cared about. The humans did not want war, and they did not seek conflict, and they were perfectly happy to let other species do whatever they wanted as long as those activities did not threaten human lives or human interests. And they would even be polite and friendly about asking potential enemies to please go away. But if you ignored their polite requests and threatened what they loved, they would respond with a ferocity and efficiency that made the most brutal Dominion campaigns look like gentle playground fights. And they would not stop until the threat was completely eliminated forever. That was what made them so terrifying. Verthax realized as the Eternal Conquest entered hyperspace and left the human destroyer behind, because you could never be sure whether you were dealing with the friendly grandmother version of humanity or the version that could destroy your entire civilization in a few hours. Captain Lucia Vance had been kind and patient and understanding throughout their entire interaction. But Verthax had seen the steel beneath her smile, and he had understood that she would have killed every single being in his armada without hesitation if he had made the wrong choice. He thought about the human history he had studied at the academy. The stories of how they had crossed vast oceans in wooden boats that should have sunk in the first storm, and how they had walked across frozen wastelands where the cold should have killed them, and how they had strapped themselves to explosive rockets just to touch their moon. Humans had nearly destroyed themselves a dozen times with wars and plagues and weapons that could crack the crust of a planet, and every time they had come back stronger and more determined. And every obstacle they faced only seemed to make them more creative and more stubborn. They were a species that did not know how to give up or accept defeat or surrender to circumstances. And they had taken their death world and turned it into a paradise through sheer willpower and endless persistence. And then they had reached out into the stars and done the same thing to 100 other worlds. Voar Dax wondered what the galaxy would look like in 1,000 years, when the humans had spread even further and grown even stronger. And he wondered whether the Dominion would even exist by then, or whether they would be just another forgotten empire that had been swept away by the tide of human expansion, but those were questions for another day and another leader. Because Verthax knew that his career was over and that he would probably spend the rest of his life in disgrace for his failure here today. And he tried to find peace with that knowledge. At least he would be alive to experience that disgrace, which was more than he could say for the 6,000 soldiers who had died on the purity of purpose when their commander had been too proud to recognize the reality of the situation far behind him in the darkness of space. Captain Lucia Vance watched the Armada disappear into hyperspace and allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. And she made a note in her log that the contact had been resolved peacefully and that minimal paperwork would be required. She walked to the small kitchen area of her ship and brewed herself a cup of tea. And she thought about the alien admiral who had been smart enough to choose life over pride. And she hoped that he would be treated well when he returned home. The remembrance began to move slowly toward the human colony it had been sent to protect, drifting through the void like a guardian returning from a successful patrol. And Captain Vance settled into her command chair with her tea and pulled up a book she had been meaning to finish for several weeks. Somewhere across the galaxy, in military academies and government halls and ships of a dozen different species, the story of what had happened here today would spread and grow, and it would become another legend about the terrifying humans and their impossible ships and their polite captains who smiled while they prepared to kill you. And somewhere in the Dominion fleet, now limping home through hyperspace, Admiral Verthax sat in his quarters and stared at the wall and thought about the lesson he had learned. The same lesson that every other species in the galaxy eventually learned when they encountered humanity: you do not fight the humans, because fighting them means dying, and dying means losing. And the humans had spent their entire existence refusing to lose. No matter what the universe threw at them, you do not threaten the humans, because threatening them means giving them a reason to pay attention to you. And their attention is the last thing any sane being should ever want. You simply pray that the humans stay friendly, and you stay far away from anything they care about. And you hope that they never have a reason to remember your name. The remembrance continued its slow journey home. And Captain Vance finished her tea and started a new chapter of her book. And the galaxy kept spinning just like it always had. And somewhere out there a species was learning why humanity had survived a death world called Earth, because the universe had tried to kill them, and they had refused to die. And now nothing in the galaxy was strong enough to finish what their own planet had started. That was the truth about humans. The truth that every species eventually discovered. And it was the truth that Admiral Verthax would carry with him for the rest of his days. The humans were not the monsters of legend or the demons of nightmare. They were simply survivors who had won the hardest fight in the universe, and nothing would ever frighten them again because they had already beaten the worst enemy they would ever face. They had beaten their own world, and everything else was easy by comparison.